All right, this is our podcast about books, and
Yay.
yay! I'm Jeff, and Tom is with me, and we have an amazing guest, Daniel Wallace, an incredible online
Hi,
teacher,
everybody.
writing coach, just general brilliant author, award-winning author, coach of award-winning authors. Yeah, so Daniel, thanks for coming. Um,
My pleasure.
see, I have to do this part because I always miss it. Um, this limited season, we are looking at books from specific genres that Tom and I had never read. And so re-exploring critical books from genres that we had never looked at. Um, did I get that right, Tom?
Yeah, I mean,
Nice.
the term we used was classics of the genre. So books that
Classics of the genre.
when you
Thank you.
think of a genre, you think of this author. And then we just made a list of stuff we hadn't read. And I think when you think of legal thriller, you definitely think of Presumed Innocent, even before the new TV series, which I have not watched. But
Oh, I
um,
watched it. Daniel, did you
yeah,
watch the new TV series? It is it is not like the book at all.
Yeah, that's what I figured. I didn't want to start watching it before this conversation because I figured it'd be different.
I read the book and then I watched the this TV series and then I had to go read the book again. So I was like, wait, what just happened? Yeah, it's different. All the characters are radically different. Um, the ending's radically different. Like everything about it is different. By the way, we've said this on every episode so far, but I'm gonna say it now too. We're gonna spoil the crap out of this thing.
yeah.
So if you haven't read it, go read it or listen to it, and then come back and listen to this because we're gonna talk about all of it.
And I had meant to rewatch the Harrison Ford movie, but I didn't, and it's probably just as well. Um, but it's funny, I looked it up and it's got like young John Spencer and young uh, Bradley Whitford, who are both in, The West Wing, are in it, and
Interesting.
just like a ton of people early career stuff.
And it's crazy. It came out 3 years after the novel was published,
Oh,
which is wild to me.
Sidney Lumet bought the rights before it was even published.
Really?
Yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah. So let's start with general thoughts on the book. Daniel, you want to go first? General thoughts?
I think this book is a classic. I think it's a masterpiece. I think that it is. I want to talk about this at length. I think that 1987 was a long time ago. The book feels very dated in a number of ways, but it is. It is. If you, if it, I feel, I worry. I'm going to do my best, but I worry that like people with a picture of what a legal thriller is are not ready for this book, which is, I think, as much a kind of like study of a sort of man in damnation, a kind of journey through hell, as it is a courtroom, who done it, how did they do it, who's going to get off. I think it's fabulous. I'm constantly underlining lines and want to send them to my like cool literary friends and say, look at this, isn't that a beautiful sentence? Um, yeah,
Yeah,
it's just full
yeah,
of
that's
wonderful
fascinating
moments.
because I grew up obsessed with Grisham. Grisham was like my guy that I read probably way too early in life, starting I think at like 12. But way too early to be reading Grisham. But it was interesting calling this a legal thriller because like you're saying, it's way more literary than I expected.
Yeah, absolutely.
I yeah, we definitely get into that. But he went to school for and taught writing before he went to law school. So um, he definitely had the literary chops to bring to it. Uh, I deeply uh, conflicted by this book because um, I didn't like any of the characters. I didn't like a lot of the choices. Never mind the dated stuff. I mean, we can get into that, but
Yeah, we'll get
although
into it.
I have some comments on that too. But I was listening to the audio and I was deeply committed to the story when I was listening to it. Often on my morning walks, and I would listen, for a solid 45 minutes, and my mind would not wander. I would be completely focused on the book, and so that means something. That something about it really grabbed me, and yet I have a list of things that I found odd, and so lots of things for discussion. So, uh, but you can definitely see it as groundbreaking for a type of thriller that was then heavily copied.
Yeah, let's start off with characters then, because I think that's a good place to kick off. What are our thoughts on Daniel? You had posed this question about how it explores middle age. What's our thoughts on Rusty, our protagonist, and the journey of the protagonist narrator who I'm not sure if he's definitely not telling us the truth all the time. I don't know that I'd call him an unreliable narrator. I don't know. What do y'all think?
Well, I mean, just to be, if you can we just, I mean, just to sort of sum up what happens in the book, and just for at least for the major
Oh,
part of
that'd
the
be
story.
great. Yeah, go
Yeah.
for it.
The premise is in some ways kind of simple. He he is supposed to investigate the murder of a colleague, or and but declines to admit that he has just had an affair with her that ended some months prior. Um, there's also a political element to the story in that these are like he's sort of dependent on this political campaign winning an election that it does not win. And so a quarter of the way through the book, he's basically his mentor, his boss is on the way out. And then evidence comes out suggesting that he is the killer, quite compelling evidence that he is the killer. And so by about halfway through, he is like the trial begins with him as the suspect, and he has a defense lawyer, and then the story progresses from there. Um, so I thought this was just a wonderful study of middle age. Um, Obviously, hopefully, I hope from all of us, more dramatic than most people's middle age experiences, but it really paints this character who has lived his whole life trying to, he's trying th something. It's a bit hard to say in words, put it exactly into words, but he has attempted to play the game. He has attempted to serve his boss and be a good soldier for Horgan, his boss. He um he has tried to be a good dad. He has, to lesser extent, tried to be at least a dutiful husband. Um, and he's seeing when the book begins, all of those things kind of crumble in front of him. He and his wife have developed this incredibly toxic um, uh, relationship of ignoring each other, silences. Um, um, he sort of views his wife as kind of living this sad, abandoned life. And it becomes clear, one of the threads that I think is really interesting in the early part of the book, that both his wife and the woman he was having an affair with are both incredibly disappointed with him for not telling Horgan to step down and instead allowing Horgan to run again and then lose, which has basically jeopardized, put his trashed his whole career. And it's a sort of interesting early plot of the story where the character sees himself as having done the right thing, but it becomes clear that nobody thinks that he has done the right thing. Um, and he's sort of totally he sort of totally has not seen this on page one. We have to watch the story unfold for him to sort of grasp it and us to kind of grasp it too. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a really dark, like I felt this was part of my conflict with the book was Rusty, and I'd like to get y'all's take on this. Like you're saying, his life is like crumbling around him. He's like losing his job, his marriage that used to be this like he describes it in the book um as this like massive sexual escapade when they first got married. They're poor and all they do is they just are banging each other all the time in front of people. Like they're just sexual wildcats. And now that's kind of fallen apart. He's distanced from his son. Like it's just all, and he's in this like weird existential, like Nietzschean dread where he's just like, this is what life is. And he's like thinking back on his dad. He's like, this is what dad was like. I don't know. I think he felt in weird times like oddly stoic about like this is how things are falling. Did y'all get that too, or did y'all
Oh, I was
read
going to
him
say
differently?
passive. Yeah, that was uh, uh, passive more than stoic, I think. And he's so passive that that was what uh, most made me wonder about his reliability because it made me wonder like, is he hiding something from the reader by making everything sort of as low key and not his fault and not his actions as possible. Like he's not doing anything. And I was wondering like is Scott Turow trying to make me think that he is lying by making him that way? Um, and which ties into to my biggest problem, one of my biggest problems that Daniel was talking about, which is the prose is beautiful. The prose is beautiful, but he made it first person. And to me, it's a massive mismatch with the character. I don't believe that the character and the character's actions match up with someone who has those soaring thoughts and descriptions and insights. There's nothing about Rusty's history that would show that he was a poet at heart. He's a guy doing his job every day. Um, and so I like, is the prose too literary for the man? And I felt like that was a big mistake. And then the other thing, I can't believe I'm referencing Desperate Housewives, but there was this show called Desperate Housewives 20 years ago. And the only thing I remember about it, because it's one of those catchphrases that I remember, is that the main woman's husband leaves her for another woman, and he says, "The heart wants what the heart wants," and she's like, "Oh, for Christ's sake!" And Rusty spends a lot of time saying, the heart wants what the heart wants, and I just wanted to be like, "Oh, for Christ's sake, man! Like, get some imagination, right?" Like, um, because he can't explain his attraction towards Caroline, and he tries to make it mystical, and it's like, dude, you just didn't have the self control that you needed. Um,
Yeah, there's an
I
interesting
didn't.
conversation around like the fantasy of her
Yeah.
and who she really is.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. But sticking to Rusty, my biggest question was like, the prose doesn't match the man. So it should have been third person if you were going to do that much beautiful. I mean, just it really, and that's part of why, yeah, I was walking and listening to it, and it was so evocative and descriptive, and all the stuff about the dad and the dad's life, and just everything he describes everywhere he goes, all these incredible descriptions. And I was like this is not the man who's been the dutiful second in command and the disappointed husband. Um, yeah, so that was deeply problematic for me, or it just made me not believe his character.
I
One thing, oh,
do
go ahead.
I
Uh,
do wonder if that's also an issue with the audiobooks, because
Mm.
I've had that experience with, say, Saul Bellows writing too, where
mhm.
when you read it, you're kind of just like, well, a guy is talking to me, I guess. I mean, that's how he speaks. But when you listen to it, it's both, it seems it's the person's got to pick a voice, and often
Mhm.
they pick a certain kind of voice, and then you have to like hear that voice say all these amazing lines, and you think, that's
Yeah,
not.
maybe, but I'm also doing the audio. Another book on our list is Salem's Lot, which has a ton of voices, and the narrator does a remarkable job with the voices. But the voices are saying things that, and he tells you what their inner thoughts are too, because it's very, third person close. He gets right in their heads, but their thoughts in their heads are in the same sort of idiomatic expressions and sort of education level as their outside one. So yeah, it was interesting for me. And it gets I've seen comparisons to things like the secret history and such in terms of the way that it is so rich. But if I remember right, that's in third person. Well, it's been a long time. I can't remember, but um,
Well, I mean, I looked at it. Can I comment on that?
Oh
oh
yeah,
yeah,
please do, man. Yeah.
I mean, yes, I think on a objective level, you are totally right. There is no creative writing history in this character's background. He is constantly, I mean, he has an amazing register of, you know, making a crude joke about a gay person in one paragraph, and then he'll talk about parabolic curves in the next. Then he'll be sort of making some kind of incantation to God. It's really stunning. I guess I saw it in that the first thing I was thinking of was like a kind of very, I don't know what to call it. Like I was thinking of it like an American take on the Victorian omniscient narrator. Like it is first person, but the premise is that Rusty is showing us this whole world. And yes, it's totally implausible that he's actually saying all these things. But like it's as if we weren't, he's sort of got like this button down omniscience where he's sort of just delivering this vision. And, it reminds me of novels in a certain tradition, I think is like this sort of visionary novel. And a British person, I find it interesting because I don't think we have that same tradition. Moby Dick, for instance, where there is a sort of in first person, but like, is all this stuff really being said by a guy? I can go on about this at length, but I
Please
thought it
do.
was,
Please do.
um, like, and I think it's a sort of very interesting, um, like this sort of religious visionary novel you get a lot of in America, like, um, in the UK, the closest thing we get to is like, I don't know, a Graham Greene novel where a character quietly concludes to themselves at the end that God is real, but there's no subjective narrative experience of it. It's just like, well, her acne cleared up at the end of the novel. Um, and I'm thinking of like Cormac McCarthy on one level, Marilyn Robinson. This book really reminded me of some of Marilyn Robinson's
Oh
novels
yeah.
where there's this sort of constant breaking through of this visionary voice,
Mhm.
and it's like, um, and I think what makes this novel difficult is that I think that if you think of it in those terms, this book is like this character is in, hell or purgatory. There's nothing, I mean, you're totally right. There is nothing good about this world. He wanders through this world seeing horrors around him. The cops are horrible. The judges are at best polite. And it is a sort of study of this city, this environment that is just completely bereft of something. But that it is bereft, I think, is significant. That it's not simply how we live, it's something's like missing from this vision.
Yeah,
yeah,
I think there's definitely something. And when you mentioned Marilyn Robinson, you're right. It feels so much like the narrator of Gilead. And it's the same kind of like he's got that narrator voice where she follows the pastor through his life. I've never met a small town pastor that talks like that talks like he does, but there's also something very authentic and true about it. There's like something like that philosophically connects with it. Um, that's really interesting. I will say I'd be curious for you guys to watch the Apple TV version of this with Jake Gyllenhaal because Jake Gyllenhaal actually changes the character to match Tom what you're saying. There's nothing poetic, there's nothing romantic, there's nothing like eh, beautiful about him. He is a gangster prosecuting attorney who like is slitting throats every day. And he's like metaphorically, and he is incredibly anxious, and he is like manic at times. Like it's how you'd expect this character going through in real life this stuff to be. And I found it really hard to watch. I was like, this guy's stressing me out.
yeah. So a few responses. I totally get what you're saying. And to me, because it reminded me, and I would never would have thought of Graham Greene, but absolutely. But also of noir. So it felt more to me like a detective noir than it felt like a thriller. And the closest you would get to somebody sort of mismatching prose like that would be Chandler. I mean, when you read Philip Marlowe, but Marlowe, is a reader, and Marlowe is more of a philosopher. Is sort of explained as more of a philosopher, even if it's unrealistic. Uh, so yeah, the whole thing felt really noir to me, and I love your idea of it, but just being a journey through hell, because the only thing that's redeeming in the whole book are the young people. There's his son, and he does, who's like this bright spot, and actually, Carolyn's son is oddly, oddly sort of like weirdly innocent, right? He's
A
just like
charming
this
character.
dude, right? Yeah, I mean, he's lovable almost because he's innocent, right? I mean, and in some ways, he's a fascinating character.
And I just before we go on, because I want to talk a lot about Carolyn and some of the I think where we start to hit the limits of this particular vision of the book. But I think it's worth just bearing in mind just like how varied the characters are in this. Like, you know, you might be listening to this thinking, well, it's just like this amazing voice, kind of Shakespearean declaiming, but lots of the characters are so vivid, and he draws the judge who has this particular kind of take on defense lawyers and prosecution, the his own defense lawyer who has this very precise, I mean, it's very racialized how he's a sort of preppy figure. Um, the kids, his wife. It's wonderfully drawn. The police feel very different. And I don't, it doesn't it just feels an incredibly varied cast that's who speak differently, who sound different to each other, who have different takes on the world. It's very well done.
Yeah, I loved Sandy, the defense attorney. I mean, I know he's very like, you know, racially typed. But I could have the scenes that his character in, I was totally drawn to. Every scene he's in. I'm like, I want to know what Sandy's gonna do. I'm like, I want to know what he's up to. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, but but of course they're all men.
yeah. Yeah.
And and even if you want to talk about it being dated, it was interesting. I came across the New York Times review of the book when it came out was written by Anne Rice,
That's
and
fascinating.
who loved it, except the ending. She hated the ending, but she loved it. But she says, she loved it even with the obvious absence of a major sympathetic female character. Like, so it's not like, oh, everything was like that in the 80s. I mean, a lot of it
Yeah.
was. And I think, a lot of the stuff you see that's dated is like, I love Sandy too, but if you want to be critical about it, he's like somebody's, how do I say this? Like, let's be diverse and make him Hispanic. Let's also make him wise. Let's make him the wise Hispanic man. And I can't quite describe it correctly, but it still feels a little off. Um, but he was my favorite, by far.
Yeah, I mean it definitely, I mean there's so many things to talk about because the book definitely presents this vision, if you want to be polite to the book. It presents this extremely racialized urban American world where, Rusty does not walk around with some sort of, I think it's fair to say, racial prejudice that he wants to share with us, but he's intensely aware of everyone's race, and their race is significant in what they do, how they relate to things.
Mhm.
And, you know, I um I don't know, to me it makes the book feel even like older than 1987, like a kind of Bernard Malamud style novel where it's talking about Jewish communities in New York City a long time before 1987. Um, I think it's worth, you mentioned Carolyn and female. It's clear that the woman he has the affair with, Carolyn, is objectively presented as being really terrible. This is not meant to be Rusty's take on her. the book the book basically says she is a fit. She seems to be this complex, interesting figure, but the plot reveals that she is um, uh, a kind of grasping climber who is incredibly like unashamed, but and it's incredibly there's no sort of like kind of uh conflict within her. She's just looking for like a successful man to climb up with. Um and yeah, it's not a very pleasant depiction of that character.
Well,
No,
as the book goes on, I was laughing because it was like, who else are we going to reveal that Caroline has slept with in order to like get her next job? Like she's just like I felt like 100 pages. It's like, oh yeah, Caroline slept with him as well to like get her job at this place. And it's just like, oh man, they're just, yeah,
uh, but she's also presented as someone who's got the city's number, right? If the city is hell, she's like, okay, I'm gonna get mine,
yeah.
right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
she's aware of the sexism, and she's just gonna take what she's gonna use it to her advantage. I mean, there's a little bit of that. I felt like there was a little bit of that in the character, and I thought one of the clever things that Turow did, and I actually had to like listen to it again because at one point I was like, wait a minute, Rusty never quite figures out that she broke up with him when she realized that he wasn't going to uh, go for Raymond's job. He never quite figures that out, which is really fascinating. And I love when writers can have a first person novel where the reader is learning more than the narrator is, because it's a good trick. It's hard to do without being foolish. And there's a couple places in this book where Turow is able to give information to the reader without Rusty quite realizing what he's telling you. And I just thought that was really good craftsmanship.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Rusty presents this affair to us in this very both poetic, but also very giddy way. You know, they suddenly have these moments where they look at each other over the books of the law case, where they're role playing out how they're gonna attack this particular trial. And once you have the full picture of what Carolyn is supposed to be in this world, it all seems absurd because, uh, as you say, she slept with most of the cast of characters, and Rusty never seems to grasp. He's like this sort of innocent abroad or innocent in the city. He doesn't seem to sort of process anything that has happened in this relationship. He doesn't process how it began. He doesn't process how it's finished.
He
And
can't
yeah,
figure out why she suddenly dropped him. It's like, but he can figure out why she dropped Raymond, which was for the same reason, right? Which is kind of funny. The author does set up a little bit like with the whole missing file and stuff. You think, oh, maybe she was trying to bring them all down, but she really wasn't. Uh, and it's kind of sad and disappointing to find that out. And then the only other, female characters is the woman in the wheelchair who doesn't get enough screen time to really matter, even though she seems like a very nice person, and his wife, who obviously is also deeply conflicted.
yeah.
So
Um,
I don't know where you want to go next,
Oh, I've got
Jeff, but I
questions.
feel like
I
we've
was just
got,
waiting to see if y'all had any
yeah,
other.
I feel like we've got Rusty pretty much
Yeah, let's talk about.
covered.
So I want to talk about Barbara, but his wife. But before we go there, Daniel, you had mentioned the like weird Christian ethos that hangs over American literature that like sits, and it's definitely like, you can feel like the ghost of Puritanism haunting this book, where like sex is seen as there's definitely a like pushback on the puritanical understanding of sex, and that it's not like that it's okay that like people are using it in a joyful way and like a not just having children type way, which I think is kind of that like Christian thing. But then there's also the like guilt of Caroline and using sex as a weapon for her own, and that is not seen as okay. Like Barbara's like love of sex is seen like, isn't she an amazing woman? Caroline's like, I'm using sex as a weapon is like, isn't she a horrible monster? Um, I found that fascinating, but I'd loved it, it goes into I think this whole idea of what is innocent. Because like you said, like this is a hellscape and everybody is guilty of something. They're all like the cop is stealing evidence. The like the attorneys are all like the worst people ever. The judge has been caught in this big scandal. And like, so what do y'all, I'd love to hear y'all's take on innocence and how that plays out. What y'all think is actually going on here around that.
You want to go ahead, Daniel?
Well, I mean, I just want to clarify one thing is that when I talk about sort of, to me, the book is a religious book in the sense that it feels like we are constantly breaking through to some other reality.
Mm,
That to me is what I mean by a religious book. The way that McCarthy's constantly doing that. People just look at a sunset and they're like, oh, the universe falling in upon itself.
interesting. Gotcha. Yeah.
That's kind of what I mean. Like it's there is like it is a book that I think is not really meant to be religious, and I think the character is not supposed to be a religious guy, but that it feels this intense sort of dissatisfaction of just like normal life, whatever you want to call that. The way that like I don't know, Jane Austen would never experience that in her novels. Like, the goal is to sort of be happy, be balanced, improve yourself, get to, get over your
Yep.
psychological issues, marry the right person. Um, this kind of book is like, what even, like what even is that? And I see that as like uh, a really fascinating, I just see that as like part of what gives this book this its power. I think it makes it difficult to copy because it's sort of not really about, who killed Carolyn, although there is a cool twist at the end about that. Um, but it's like it's this feeling of Harold Bloom talks about this idea of like sort of like vast numbers of Americans will say they have a personal relationship with Jesus that most other countries don't talk about. That they do not, the surveys do not show that. Even very religious
Mhm.
cultures, that this feeling of like, people in America attributing, I'm speaking as a British person here, but like attributing tiny events to, God looking out for them. I see the book in that sense, like that there is that we feel like we're constantly on the edge, and that he has that experience sometimes. There's a kind of divine sexuality with Carolyn that he at times experiences. Um, that's kind of what I mean.
Yeah, and I think I'm tying into I love that depiction of what you're talking about religion. I think for me there's a parallel in this idea of innocence and in this idea of like who's guilty and who's not. Part of what I struggled with was I didn't know if Turo was doing it on purpose or if it was just his worldview. But the book definitely has it kind of reeks of white suburban Christianity in that, like, when people in power do wrong things, it's kind of okay. Like, you can see it in the book really strongly in like how the cops talk about the criminals, even though the cops are all also criminals. Right? Like they're like, no, we're doing it's okay that we do it because we're doing it for quote unquote the right reasons or because we're like justified by like whatever or like the judge it's revealed has done this like awful thing in the past has been part of this like big bribery scam and it's like there's no like desire to prosecute him for that or to like chase him down for that. It's just like Rusty's just kind of like, this is what people do. Like it's, but Caroline does it, like somebody who's in like a minority position, she does it, and it's like this woman is the devil. And I like that's part of what I was struggling with the book is like he's given it the title presumed innocent. And there's clearly this like conversation going on about who's guilty, who's innocent, who's okay, who's not okay. And it definitely connects to this like understanding of God and existentialism and like this like revealing of reality to the protagonist as his life falls apart. By the way, he seems to be the only one that doesn't have a big scandal in his fact. He seems to be like he's just been doing his job, right? Like he's not like there's nothing like he hasn't lied, he hasn't like stolen any evidence, he hasn't and what everybody else has. But I don't know. I guess that's where my question around religion in the book came from. And the question of innocence is like I couldn't tell if Turow was doing that on purpose or if that's just the perspective he's writing from. And I guess that's where, because like Elmore Leonard also has like really interesting conversations about race. I don't think Elmore Leonard was intending to have those conversations about race. I think Elmore Leonard was just writing who Elmore Leonard is. Like, so there's a, yeah, I struggled with that. And I didn't know how to place it. Um, yeah, but
So
we,
I'm the worst person in the world to talk about Christian themes and anything because I'm a raging atheist. But and I think
I love
Elmore
it when you
Leonard
talk about Christian
I
themes. It's
think
my
Elmore
favorite.
Leonard was writing not what he believed but what he heard.
Yeah.
In the same way that David Milch wrote Deadwood, I don't think that those were necessarily his thoughts on race and sex when he was writing Deadwood. But there are lots of really thorny questions about who's guilty and who's not. And we just talked about what a horrible person Caroline is, but in some ways she's the innocent one. And in some ways she is not doing she's not doing as many things. I mean, she's not killing anybody. Is Barbara the innocent one? No. Is
Well,
Rusty? No. Is Raymond? No. Is Nico or Tawny? No. No. Even the sidekick detective there
lip.
ends up yeah, he ends up also being dishonest to help his friend. Um
Yeah. And I'm just to add to what you're saying real quick, I think a modern version of this novel actually champions Caroline as a hero for what she's doing. I think a modern version of it does. And yeah,
she is not presenting herself as anything that she's not. She's not presenting. We don't get to. I mean, she's already dead. It's kind of
yeah,
like
we don't
Laura.
ever
Like
see her
we don't
perspective. Yeah.
get her perspective, but in a lot of ways, that what you get from hearsay is not her really particularly presenting herself as something that she's not. She doesn't have a fake virtue that I could tell. Rusty totally does. Like, all I've done is try to do a good job every day, except for this, horrible affair that I had. Um, and I think he also sees himself as vindicated because of the way that he saves his wife.
Mm,
Because he knows. Or maybe, and it's they have this very long, like this like Harry Potter long wind down after the finale where they're in the kitchen just talking and talking and talking and talking. And uh and he sort of swings wildly between like, well, I never could have proved it was her to like, she did it because of me or, and she told me that she she just wanted me to, feel the heat. She didn't meant for it to go that far. And it's like, still murdered her, right? Right? Like there's it gets very, very confusing and muddled, but I feel like he thinks he is doing the honorable thing by protecting her. And one of the fun things about that last third of the novel is trying to figure out when he has figured it out, right? Like there's the point where I figure it out. And then there's a point somewhere along where Rusty figures it out. But he doesn't tell us, even though he's the first person narrator. He has figured it out somewhere along the line, and he hasn't told us. And, it's not a book I'm going to reread, but if I were to reread it, yeah, I would be looking for those sort of interesting author type things that he did because there's a lot of skill in the writing of this book. As much as I'm like trashing parts of it, there's a
yeah,
lot
I
of
wouldn't say
skill.
you're trashing it. I think we're just examining it. Daniel, you got any thoughts on the pacing or the or what was said?
Well, I think that this is one where the Harrison Ford film does a really good job of presenting that finale quickly and efficiently, where he sort of, like the character, Harrison Ford character puts together what must have happened. There's a sort of sequence where he's like, wait, I realize who the killer is. It was my wife. And then there's a sort of quick explanation to the camera of like voiceover of like, what's he going to do about it?
Mm.
Which is nothing. Um, I'm sort of, I think that the question of innocence, to go back to this question of innocence and like, what does Rusty know? When does he know it? I think that there's like an interesting thing of like, in a novel, I don't know how to put this exactly, but it's like, a novel's not real life. So we just, we're never going to meet a Rusty. And I think that there's like an interesting sort of thing in novels of like this innocent that, I'm thinking of like, say, Newland Archer in The Age of Innocence. Newland has done bad things in his life. He has almost led a married woman to close to suicide with his just having a rather irresponsible affair with her. But he's presented as essentially an innocent, and he continues that way through the novel. He's kind of led along by his wife, by the people around him, and I think there's a sort of interesting thing of like the protagonist as an innocent. Like,
Mm.
you could look at it objectively and say, has Rusty done bad things? In fact, he's lying to for reasons that are not completely clear. He's like lying to a lot of people through the book. He's lying to his defense lawyer. It's not completely clear why. Um, but he's just sort of presented as like the sort of conscience of this story in a way that is like it doesn't make sense if you sort of go back and look at it all and say, well, how could he have been this guy? He and I think that there's a wonderful scene, chapter 21, which I absolutely adore this scene as a question of like just scene design, where they go to meet Horgan to find out his old boss, who's now his sort of ex-boss, because Horgan has lost his job and is got this cushy new job as a fancy lawyer. And they've slowly begun to realize that Horgan's going to testify against Rusty. And it's an incredible scene. I mean, it is, and it has all the. Can I talk about the scene for a
Oh
bit?
yeah, please do. Yeah, I love
This
this
is
scene.
chapter,
It's
people listening
yeah,
to this, chapter 21.
it's like my favorite Sandy scene. It's great.
Sandy's incredible. And it's just after the rampant sex scene in chapter 20, which is also fantastic and
Yeah.
also a wonderful bit of writing. So in this scene, it's laid out so well. They know there's something off, they're not sure what happens, and like a good scene design, there's a what I call in my writing classes an orientation, which is what does the character want? It's stated on the page. And Sandy says, don't say anything, just listen. You're here just to facilitate conversation. You're not supposed to speak. And Rusty sort of nods and agrees. And there's this wonderful bit at the beginning where Horgan is dissembling, he's being affable, he's saying, oh, they had a few conversations with me. And there's this wonderful moment that I think writers should really study where Horgan is saying these kind of like non-responses, and Rusty starts translating them for us into sort of law speak, into prosecution speak. And Rusty's like, trembling with rage, with panic, because what Horgan is actually saying is, "I'm the star witness. I'm their main tool to crush you." And I think that many writers, if you as your writing teacher, would try to put that in dialogue. You're saying you're the star witness, and it's like would ring totally false. But instead, it's like Rusty starts explaining to us what's going on, and he's trembling. And there's this wonderful Sandy, the Argentinian Sandy is like, please tell us, what do you plan to do? And he's very precise, got hat on his lap, his hat over his briefcase. And um, and then Rusty starts to get agitated. He starts to break the plan. A great scene because there's a twist. Rusty starts to get too angry, so he starts asking questions. And then there's this wonderful reversal, which is Horgan blames Rusty for everything. And Rusty has spent the first half of the book telling us, "Oh, I did everything for Horgan. I sacrificed myself. I was the good. I should have run, but I didn't because I wanted to be loyal." And he has this kind of like wounded puppy dog whole look, and then it turns out Horgan blames him for his own all his problems. He thinks Rusty did it, and he's gonna, or he, if he, whether or not he did or not, he's gonna destroy Rusty. It's an incredible scene. And then Rusty walks out and like has this kind of desperate plea to God that he says he does not believe in because it's like now the trial is like real to him. Now he realizes they have a very strong case against him. He looks terrible, and he's just sort of pleading with the heavens to deliver him in some way. And it's just I think it's a wonderful scene.
Yeah, and I love there's a great comedic moment at the end too where Sandy comes out. Sandy's conclusion for the whole thing is, I didn't know Horgan was sleeping with Caroline. That's his like he's like, you probably could have told me that. Like it's a great like into this like fantastic, deep scene you're talking about. Yeah, it was that was an incredible scene.
think
And
I think that Sandy's a great character because the premise is that the main character is constantly looking at Sandy to sort of judge like, does Sandy respect me? Does Sandy believe me? And it's like there's just this small moment of Sandy saying, "You could have told me all of this. Like, what the hell were you thinking?"
I didn't
And
have
the
to be
reader too is like, "Wait,
surprised.
why didn't you do it?" And that's all Sandy needs to do. It's just totally crushing. Like as Sandy's respect falls for him, he feels worse and worse.
Yeah.
Well, there's also this running subtext if you're keyed into Sandy that he is totally aware that Rusty's keeping things from him, but he also knows that him knowing those things could be dangerous, and he's constantly calibrating which is worse, not knowing or preserving the sort of uh, ignorance that he needs to truthfully go in there and argue without lying, and it's he's uh, and so it allows Turow to move the whole third quarter of the book moves forward with everybody sort of knowing things, but nobody really saying them. And it's kind of fascinating how that moves.
Yeah. Is there
And
oh, go ahead.
oh, I
Sorry.
was just going to say, and we're talking about classics of the genre or whatever, but there is so much legal shit, and it's great. It's great. I never tuned out of it, and uh, it could easily have been like sometimes people just go, you know, uh, another book on our list was Andromeda Strain, and oh my God, there's more exposition than I need, way more. And somehow I was fascinated by all of the court stuff, uh, all of the legal stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a way in which Rusty is such a great, I mean, he's very unreliable about his own life, but he's a great kind of explainer to the reader of everything that's happening, why it matters, what's going on. And there's a great kind, I mean, it's very impressively done where like the judge will say, well, how about we try this? And then the two teams will look at each other. One will be happy, one will be sad. He very efficiently explains what it means. And then Sandy will stand up and say, like, we accept. And it's like a small victory, and then there's like another problem. And it's done in a way that Rusty is just this great ambassador to that world, where he's just filling it all in for you in a way that you can never experience in real life. Like you can't experience it watching the movie because all you get to see is like a handsome actor picking up a piece of paper and bringing it over to someone else. And with the book, you get like this voice sort of chatting to you and saying, "Oh, well, it's lucky we got that judge because that other judge," and it's you can do a little of it in a film, but there's just so much that you can deliver in a novel, a 300-page novel. It's amazing.
Yeah, and which is, the novel does give you some space. I was thinking as we were talking about Chandler and other things that one of the things the tone, which I saw it as Chicago. I think you were supposed to see it as Chicago, um, even though it's Kendall County is like Cook County. Um, but it reminded me a bit of the movie Chinatown, which came out a
Mm.
decade before. And Turo obviously would have seen. And there's parts in Chinatown where they're talking about water rights, and you're just like, okay, I'm lost. Right, right. And I never felt like that in this book. I never felt like I, all of the legalese was made. And you're right, it was all done in Rusty's voice. It was done well. And even with a little bit of good humor, where he, as a lifelong prosecutor, is sort of learning to appreciate what Sandy is doing. And yeah, so kudos on that. Got anything else?
Yeah, anything else we want to talk about with the book? Oh, we covered a lot. Daniel,
I
you got
have a
any other
couple,
topics?
I have a couple one more.
Yeah, go
Yeah.
for it.
I just think just to sort of, to one last thing, it's just the pacing I think is so interesting.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, in my edition, or at least reading my version of it, we basically we have like the first quarter of the book is this murder investigation into Carolyn, and it seems at to the quarter mark to be a fairly kind of like, I guess you could call it like a straight murder investigation. Like if you stopped reading a quarter way in, you'd say to yourself something like, "Wow, Rusty doesn't seem to be getting very far in this,
Yeah.
but I guess he'll figure it out eventually."
He's a bad
Uh,
lawyer at the first quarter of the book.
you're sort of like,
He's bad at it. Yeah.
like they're not really getting very far, but I guess the pace could be picked up a little bit, but they'll get there eventually. And then there is like a huge turning point where Horgan's basically out by a quarter of the way through. And then a third of the way through, that's when the bombshell that they're now gonna arrest and prosecute Rusty for the crime. And the evidence starts to come back. DNA, well, like evidence of his sperm being on this, unfortunately being present in the crime scene in the murder victim. Um, and then and the trial begins at basically about the halfway point. And I think that's just a really interesting way of building up the story. And I think it's something that's always sort of this fascinating, thrilling question of like, what is the beginning of a story? Why do we need, like why does I think a book that feels very well paced, you're reading it, you feel like this is moving quickly, and yet it takes like half the book for the trial to begin. I think that's like a question that I find sort of constantly fascinating about novels. Um, you sort of get to the halfway and you're like, what are we doing up to this point? Because now the story begins, but I've been gripped the whole way through.
And there's a lot of like something I really liked about the pacing is that I think, in my own writing, I am very bad at this. There's a lot of like hidden stories happening that are revealed halfway through. Like halfway through, we learn, oh, Tommy, the like prosecutor that's actually going to prosecute the case, he's actually been having his own story going on this whole time. On top of Rusty, he's been like following behind him. He's been like investigating Rusty without Rusty knowing. He's been messing with things. Like he's been like screwing with evidence so that Rusty like couldn't find things. Like there's this whole story that comes out that's been going on in the background that the protagonist didn't know about. And then there's another whole story with like, Lip, his like sidekick, Rusty's sidekick out there like investigating the other characters in the case, and like he's doing his own thing. And then you don't actually learn that like Lip has had a giant impact on stuff until the last 100, like 75 pages. Like, and then you're like, oh, if from Rusty's perspective, Lip kind of saves the day in a lot of ways. Like he's, you've got this. Yeah, it was. I thought I agree with you. It was beautifully paced and like really interestingly woven together. Um,
Yeah. And a minor thing that he does that shows how he's using the difference, because some of the story, like he keeps talking about the Nighthawks or whatever they were, and you know, setting up the judge as someone who's best friends with Raymond, who has clearly screwed Rusty over, but also covering up his own misdeed, but also hates the state and always, likes to. I mean, you just don't know which way that judge is going to go, which is pretty clever. One of the things that I thought of in this book that I think of quite a bit is, and as I'm older now and have read a lot of authors, and I have the benefit now of knowing authors that I like. And so when an author that I like has a book now, I have the luxury of no longer reading the synopsis. Um, and this book would be so much better if you didn't come into it knowing that Rusty is going to be accused. But it's on the jacket copy because that's how do you sell the novel otherwise? Which is interesting. If you look up the Anne Rice review is very, very short, but she in no way gives that away. And I thought, well, at least she's trying. But really, even the book, these days, the Amazon description, if they want you to read it, it's going to be like a prosecutor accused of a deadly crime. Like, there's no way that's not going to be part of the hook to sell it, and it's too bad because like that is part of what you're admiring in the structure is that is set in there, and of course the fact that then followed by did he do it or not, and then the reveal of who actually did is all these great little twists that but that first one is spoiled, and I don't know how you not spoil it. But I try now to not spoil books that I'm going to read by just not reading anything about them.
When I think, oh, go ahead, Daniel. Sorry.
No, I was just agreeing. Yeah, it's the Hulk shows up in that Thor film. They're gonna show you that in the trailer to get you to watch it.
Yes,
Man,
which
if they
is
had kept hold that
oh,
back, it would have
that
been
is
much
a
funnier.
perfect description. That is a perfect example in Ragnarok. Yeah,
Yeah, I think I am more. I think when it comes to the pacing, part of what impresses me so much about the book is the choice to go first person POV. Because I think if I had like storyboarded out this thing where I'm like, okay, Tommy's having this investigation and Rusty's doing this, and and then the lip is doing this. I was like, oh, this is a multi POV book. Right away. Like I immediately would have gone to third person, multiple POVs. We're telling all their stories at the same time. And I look at what Turow did and I'm like, no, no, this is like part of the master work of this book is that he makes this decision to give it all in Rusty's perspective and it forces you to have this unveiling of what's happening. That is,
which is
yeah,
which is the noir. I mean,
yeah,
that's the most noir is in first person.
yeah.
Yeah, and then just to get back to go full circle to our earlier conversation, it is in a sense totally implausible that Rusty is able to sort of track all this, that all the information filters down. Do you think about your own life? You're constantly sort of like, wait, they're not together anymore? You
Yeah.
don't get the little explanation filtered down
Yeah,
to you by other people. But in this book, it all comes together. But I think it's a really good, for the person for the person interested in craft, like I do think that many writers reach for that multiple POV. Like, how else am I going to explain it? And it's like a book like this really shows you, well, it can all come. You have to, the reader has to be patient. You have to sort of wait for the orders to filter through. But Rusty is just such a great, um, I mean, sort of strange storyteller that you get it all, and um, uh, yeah, you have to wait to find out why everyone is doing what they're doing. But and he's very good as well, just quickly, he's also very good as well at sort of giving like a plausible reason sometimes. Like, oh, they seem to be involved in the case. Well, I guess they don't like Horgan. Well, there's more to it than that, Rusty, but we have to wait 50 pages. Oh, the judge seems oddly polite to me and wants to get this case over with quickly. I guess he doesn't like prosecutors. And there's so the reader is never kind of like, oh, one like there's never like a sort of absence of a justification. It's like explained to you. I mean, not always. It's often explained to you. Carolyn's just in love with me. It's
Yeah.
just a perfect relationship. Um,
Barbara
and
likes to
then
have sex with me again because she's feels bad for me in court.
and it
And
just
that's
yeah, and then it just sort of then there's like a new reality dawns. It's wonderfully done.
yeah. Okay, I think that's a great place to stop because Daniel, that's a beautiful. So we ask every guest we bring on, and I didn't warn you about this in advance. Um, would you recommend a book to to the listeners? Something you think that they should read. Doesn't have to do with Presumed Innocent, whatever you want.
Just
Like,
anything.
hey, just any book.
And it doesn't have to be just one.
Well, I'm going to recommend the book that I've referenced in this conversation, which is Housekeeping by Marilynne Robinson. If you like this talk of, you know, Old Testament reality bursting through everyday life, and you just like, I like that, but I'd like a woman to be doing it, not a male and an awful male character. Housekeeping, published in 1980. So
Hmm.
people were able to write compelling female characters in 1980, 7 years before this book came out. Um, is a Robinson describes it as being her attempt to rewrite Moby Dick, but with no male characters. Um, I can't really tell you what happens in the book. It's not really the point, but I just read it in a coffee shop in Philadelphia and thinking, what a classic. This is just a modern classic written in my lifetime. And it is in a way that I think the later books, Gilead is wonderful, but I do feel like she tones it down a bit, and Housekeeping is like true book of Job, you
Interesting.
know, whales emerging, the dead arising.
Wow.
Um,
It's a lot shorter than Moby Dick, too.
yeah, and there's no whale facts chapters, thankfully. So yeah, I recommend that's the book I'd recommend.
Nice. I haven't read that. I'm totally checking that out.
You know,
Um,
Jeff, she wrote that and then she wrote Gilead 20 years later with no
yeah.
book in between.
No, I didn't know there was no book in between.
No book in between.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so fascinating.
I love author stories. They're the best. They're always like we talk about, like, oh, this is what the industry is, but author stories are always like, no, it didn't work that way. Yeah. Oh, that's great. All right. Well, Daniel, thank you. I'm gonna hit stop on the recording and we can chat a little bit more.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.